but we've not started the meeting yet. Okay.
It's always nice to have a heads up like that because we've seen other governmental agencies and governmental meetings wherein folks haven't always remembered that, you know, what you say and what you do when the recording is going is being broadcast. So you always need to be mindful of that anyway, but you should be more mindful of it, especially when folks are on that you can't see or hear from.
Right.
Okay.
Kathy, do you guys think you're going to open up your council chambers in the near future for council meetings, or what are you thinking?
We're thinking, or they're targeting July 1st. We're at about 75% have had one shot. So, and we're over 40% have had two. So we're
Excellent. Yeah, I think we're looking, maybe, my guess, we haven't talked about it formally, but my thinking is second meeting in July, maybe in August, of course, being a recess, we may just wait till September.
Yeah. Well, we would only be, council members would be in the chamber. It would not, the chamber would not be open
Okay.
to the public in July. They're just, the staff doesn't feel they're ready on how to set it up.
And when you come over to our side of the woods, take a look at our brand new city hall that we've built, brand new library and a brand new police station, all brand new buildings that the city hall just became occupied in the last 30 days. Oh, they're gorgeous.
Oh, wow. I'll have to
You know,
do
we
that.
had one of those typical government buildings from, you know, the late 50s, early 60s, you know, the 5-6 stories. They were great at the time, but just simply are not, you know, as attractive as they might have been at one time. The fact that we've been able to double our library size is going to be a huge bonus. Yeah.
Great. So I see that we have a quorum.
Oh, we do.
And we are ready to begin.
Great. So let's go ahead and call the Finance and Procurement meeting to order. I'll ask Adrian if you'd be kind enough to take roll, please.
Yes. Director Marquez.
Present.
Director Valle. Director King. Director Narum.
Here.
And Chair Hannon.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. So again, thank you for all those that are in attendance today. It is a Friday afternoon, and we certainly appreciate your attendance today. So let's go ahead and proceed into the agenda. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the March 10th meeting. Adrian, is there anyone in the public that would like to discuss the minutes prior to our taking a vote?
We do have one hand raised. I think it's for public comment. But I can, would you like me to recognize Jessica Tovar now or during the public comments?
Since I already opened up the discussion on the minutes, let's go ahead and do the minutes first, and then I'll come back and do public comment right after that.
Okay, great.
So the gentleman can either speak to the minutes or the public comment, which will follow this item.
Great. So roll call for.
So let's go ahead and I need a motion and a second to approve the minutes of March 10th or any corrections that any board member might have.
I'll move the minutes from the meeting held on March 10th.
Thank you, Member Marquez.
I guess I'll second them. I wasn't there.
And that's okay. My understanding is you don't need to be in attendance to make a motion on minutes. So we have a motion from Councilmember Marquez and a second from Councilmember Narum. We can go ahead and take a roll call vote now.
Great, thank you. Director Marquez.
Aye.
Director Valle. Director King. Director Narum.
Aye.
And Chair Hannon.
Aye. Thank you. That passes this. Let's go ahead and take public comment on any item that is not currently agendized today. If there's any member of the public that would like to speak to an item that's not on the agenda, we'll use that opportunity now. And I'll look to Adrian to recognize any member of the public.
Jessica Tovar is recognized for 3 minutes.
Hello, thank you, Jessica Tovar, East Bay Clean Power Alliance. And I just want to highlight just 2 issues that we've been highlighting in other meetings, but just to keep it on your radar. First, I want to thank you, rest of the board as well for recognizing, the issue with the backlog of utility debt that's related to the pandemic, which is a huge issue. And, your attention and action on that issue is greatly appreciated. And then the other thing I wanted to just emphasize that we've brought up before is the Resilience Hub energy, having islandable solar and battery storage for community trusted resilience hubs is very important, because that is the way that we'll be able to survive these planned power shutoffs that are instituted. Is pretty much PG&E's response to preventing wildfires, is to abrupt shut off of power on windy days or days that are deemed potential to cause wildfires. And so that is something that I think really needs investment, because the islandable solar battery storage is expensive. First of all, for community groups, grassroots community groups. And then the other thing is, East Bay Community Energy could play a role in perhaps other resources, other funding outside of East Bay Community Energy funds, as well as potential technical assistance. So just wanted to put that on your radar, because we are expecting the next 10 years to be experiencing these planned power shutoffs. And even though they're called planned power shutoffs, we're not actually, PG&E doesn't have to notice us when they're about to shut power off. But they're referred to as planned because they do them in response to supposedly preventing wildfires. But just to note that even though this is their approach, we have seen wildfires happen anyway. So we're looking at 10 years of power shutoffs. And then the other thing to add is, we don't know what other crises we will experience down the line. It could be earthquakes, it could be many other climate-related catastrophes, and just again uplifting that we are still in a global pandemic. So having this kind of resilience is very important. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Adrian, any other public comments?
There are no further speakers for public comment.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and move on to item item 4 on the agenda, prepay transactions update. This is an informational item. Staff?
Great.
I'm not sure who makes the report.
I will be presenting on the prepay transaction. As a quick reminder, this is a topic that has been presented on a number of other occasions, both sort of an overview of the transaction as well as some specific action items where we had to get approval for counterparty agreements, the recent formation of the JPA of the bond conduit. So some of this may be a little bit of repeat, but I think the feedback we've heard from the board in the past is this is a fairly technical financial transaction. So the more repetition, the better. And we are seeing markets open up now. And so, we see an opportunity potentially go and actually transact on something like this here in the summer timeframe. And so it is becoming more real. And so, want to make sure to walk through all the details as necessary here, answer any questions, and then, also take it to the full board probably in the May and June timeframe for some additional review. So, Adrian, if you can go to the first slide. The first is just a real basic overview of what a prepaid transaction is. It's a long-term, non-recourse financial transaction between a tax-exempt load-serving entity, in this case EBCE, of course, and we are working jointly with Silicon Valley Community Energy, and a taxable financial counterparty. In this case, we're working with Morgan Stanley specifically, and it utilizes the municipal bond market in order to raise that capital and do a prepay of our energy, thereby lowering the sort of customer-related energy costs. We put a tentative size of about $600 to $800 million in bond notional. There definitely is a range beyond that. Both, it could be lower, it could be higher, but it's really determined by the market interest at the time that a bond is sort of priced and placed, which is specific to the California sort of investment market. Municipal utilities, I should say, and other tax exempt utilities such as CCAs can utilize prepays. It's traditionally been done with more natural gas structures. I would say that's a sort of a tried and true approach, which has been pretty widely done by different municipal utilities throughout the country, and certainly in California as well, and is being applied towards renewables PPAs at this time. And it is codified in U.S. tax law, which is what enables that sort of taxable tax exempt spread. Adrian, next slide, please. So some more details on this sort of structure. The term is typically a 30-year term. They found that just tends to get this sort of optimal economics in terms of getting that sort of spread between the taxable and tax exempt. But there is a repricing period every 5 to 7 years. And that's really based off of, if you do basically a 5 to 7 year bond price and look at the taxable and tax exempt spread, and then you assume you do that and recycle that for a 30-year period every sort of 5 to 7 years. That's what sort of optimizes that discount value that is obtained through this type of a transaction. The transacting parties, I mentioned this already, but EBCE is the tax exempt load serving entity. In this case, we're talking to Morgan Stanley, which is the taxable financial counterparty, which serves as the prepay supplier. And really the process here is the prepay supplier is assigned an existing energy supply contract that the load serving entity EBCE has. So we're taking existing energy commodities transactions. In this case, we're primarily looking at long-term PPAs, but also looking at short-term commodities sort of hedges that we have in place, and we actually assign it into into the prepay supplier to actually be the seller to us. The municipal bonds are issued by the conduit being the JPA that we recently received board approval on, is what actually issues the municipal bonds on behalf of really the CCAs. And that's what gets us to that sort of combined notional value that I referenced previously. The prepay supplier pays the contract price to the PPA seller. So in this case, it would be, Morgan Stanley paying directly to our existing counterparties, and then they immediately transfer all electricity attributes to the load serving entity, of course, that being us. And then the load serving entity pays the prepay supplier at a discounted rate because of the debt sort of spread savings. The takeaway here is really the prepay supplier is effectively becoming the energy supplier and is prepaid for the future energy deliveries for these various long-term PPAs. And the prepay supplier holds and utilizes the capital, and then therefore provides a discount to the prepay buyer, us, that is enabled via the spread of the taxable and the tax exempt borrowing costs. The benefits, some of them are just very straightforward, really lower our energy procurement costs. So we would have a savings over a 30-year period, somewhere between the 5 to 15% range. There is a range because of that 5 to 7 year repricing period. It will be determined by the sort of the prevailing market conditions at the time that the bonds are repriced. So, there is a potential that discount would decrease. I think right now at the outset, we are projecting roughly 10% savings on the particular contracts that we would flow through this type of transaction. And then the risks, we have noted these in the past. There are some regulatory risks specific to the fact that SB 350 requires long-term PPAs, and the fact that if we were to assign a PPA through this transaction and it flows back to us, is there any risk that they would deem this to not be a long-term PPA for some reason? We have had meetings with the CPUC. We feel like we've kind of run this issue to ground and feel like it's a very, very minimal risk, but want to be transparent and sort of flagging that you can't say zero for anything. So it is something that's worth flagging there. And then specifically emissions performance standard is another risk that we feel like we've run to ground, which is to ensure that these are source specified contracts. This is a California specific regulation that's in place to ensure that if you have long-term contracts in place, that they are low emissions contracts. So given that we're looking at this primarily for long-term renewable PPAs or other carbon-free resources, we think this is a very low risk. Next slide, Adrian. So here's just a quick summary of some of the major parties that are involved with this particular transaction. We're looking to do this jointly with Silicon Valley Clean Energy. There are other CCAs out there that are also evaluating this exact transaction, in some cases with other financial counterparties. We initiated this process with Silicon Valley from the outset. We felt like since this would be the first prepaid transaction that a CCA would undergo, which it is possible another CCA may actually end up transacting on this before this, but at least at the time, there were no existing transactions that had been done by CCA. So we felt like it was prudent to, one, limit the actual notionals that we would be responsible for with this transaction, and two, just to have another party involved with this so that we're diligencing it together. It's been very helpful to have more eyes, more brains thinking about this transaction, asking questions about risk and things like that. And we've been pretty well aligned with Silicon Valley as to how we approach this. So that's been a really good partnership. The council role in both of these outside councils were brought to the board for action and approval given the size of the contracts. Oric, Harrington, Sutcliffe was selected as the bond and tax counsel, and then Chapman and Cutler was selected as disclosure and issuers counsel. Both were through solicitation issued in June of 2020, so almost a year ago. The prepay supplier, as I mentioned, is Morgan Stanley in this case. There are a handful of financial institutions that are able to do this type of transaction. We've seen over the years, over the last couple decades, sometimes there's more players, sometimes there are less. But at this time, there's just a handful of kind of credible providers in this space, and they were selected through a solicitation as well that was issued in November of 2019. So we have been at this for about a year and a half and really diligencing the structure and negotiating with them. The municipal financial advisor is PFM. They were also selected through a solicitation issued in September of 2020. They are an entity we've worked with in the past and other things such as our credit facility, so we know PFM well. And then the last one is the bond issuing conduit called California Community Choice Financing Authority. We did just get approval from the board to form this JPA. 3 of the 4 founding members, EBCE, MCE, and Silicon Valley have approval, and 3CE is seeking board approval really imminently, so don't expect any hiccups in that process. So very shortly, we will be able to officially form the JPA. Not listed here, but I'll just touch on, there are some other parties, involved with a much more limited scope. There are sort of like there's a commodities swap counterparty that sort of swaps a fixed to floating rate in this, and that will be solicited through a solicitation. So there is another party there. There will be a credit rating that was actually done on the transaction itself. It's not on EBCE, but done on the transaction. So we will select one of the major credit rating agencies to complete that task. And I think those are really the bulk of the parties to highlight. So Adrian, we can flip to the next slide. Key elements of the prepaid transaction. Some of this has been kind of stated before, but I want to emphasize it. We are looking at taking existing renewable PPAs, and it can be other commodities transactions as well, as long as they are source specified commodities transactions. But obviously the majority of our contracts are renewable PPAs. We may consider some shorter term, large hydrocarbon free transactions to flow through there as well. So that is sort of TBD in terms of how we want to move forward with the transaction. But The good news is we have a lot of flexibility for whatever type of energy transaction we want to flow through there. The way the transaction is structured and set up gives us that flexibility. So we're not locked into having to provide a certain contract and that alone. So existing PPAs that we would otherwise sign anyways would be flowed through the transaction. We really continue to perform in these sort of take and pay PPAs. It's a limited assignment of rights and energy products. And operationally, we retain all control over the projects to the extent we are already, the scheduling coordinator. Obviously, on some projects, the developer actually is the scheduling coordinator and operates the project because there may be multiple off-takers, but none of that sort of operational nature changes as a result of that. And so all other terms of the PPA are unchanged. If the prepaid program terminates early for some reason, if a prepaid supplier fails to perform, there's a change in tax code, the LLC fails to perform for some reason, really what happens is we forego future savings. It's possible the transaction collapses. It's possible that if we're the failing party, that the actual transaction can continue, but it would not involve us. And so Morgan Stanley can actually remarket to other parties, but we would really be taken out of it. And in that case, the assigned PPA would get put back to us. So it really doesn't even change the credit exposure for our energy counterparties who are selling the energy to us originally. Their risk is still to us. So there's no material change in those regards. As it relates to this being debt, it is non-recourse. So prepays utilize non-recourse municipal bonds. They're not secured or guaranteed by the CCA itself. It is actually recourse to the prepay supplier itself. And so they have more liability that they have to manage. And so this generally protects the CCA and mitigates any risk of the bond itself. And of course, it is off balance sheet. So it is not on our balance sheet. It's specifically issued through that conduit that we now have approval for. Next slide, Adrian. I talked a little bit about the sizing in that $600 to $800 million range. The notional could be as high as 1.5 billion. I think that's really a high watermark. It is going to be dependent on sort of institutional investor interest in the California market. Fortunately, California generally has high taxes, so this is a market that this type of a structure works well for, and there generally is good bond investor appetite. And there is increasing interest we've heard in these types of green bonds, because this is the underlying commodities transaction tend to be green transactions. That also spurs a little bit of interest. So it's always difficult for financial institutions to know what exactly will be the bond size if you're trying to optimize the spread. And so we want to be able to go out there for as high as 1.5 billion. Again, we would split this between us and Silicon Valley. I think the more practical size that we would envision is probably more like that $600, $800 million range. The higher that bond notional just means the higher the discount that, based off of more commodities flowing through there, and that same discount percentage that we're projecting of around 10% would get applied to a higher notional. So there is an interest to try to get more bond interest, but obviously the more you do that, the more the bond price may increase, and that would diminish the spread. So that's where there's sort of an optimization that happens. And this notional amount that I'm referencing here represents the present value of all of the PPA cash flows over the 30-year life. That's why you get to, of course, that significant dollar level. Moving on, that's sort of that next bullet. The initial transaction is being split between Silicon Valley and EBCE. When you look at that present value bond notional, it actually amounts to about $12 to $16 million of annual procurement costs per year. So sizable, but obviously on an annual basis, nowhere near that sort of $600, $800 million range, as you can appreciate. And so if you think about a 10% projected cost savings, this transaction would amount to about $1.2, $1.6 million, which again is material, but is, when you think about our overall financials, is fairly small. The transaction in this case does assume an increase in cash flows over the life of the transaction. So while the initial years in that $12 to $60 million range, in the later years, it would increase this over the $20 to $25 million range. As the transaction moves forward, the actual arbitrage value goes down because the present value benefits reduce with a shorter remaining tenor. So at the outset, you have 30 years of present value sort of arbitrage spread between taxable and tax exempt, and that there's a greater benefit as a result of that. As the transaction moves forward, the remaining life of it reduces. So it'll go 25, 20, 15, 10 years in life, and as that happens, of course, you have less value because you're really looking at the present value of these spreads. So that's just sort of kind of the nature of how the discount factor works. So I would expect that to go down in future years. With that said, there is a negotiated minimum discount that the prepay supplier needs to provide. That is not necessarily a guarantee that we will get that discount, but really what that means is that if they are not able to hit that discount, we as a participant can actually walk away from the transaction. So to the extent there's a better mousetrap that is invented in 10, 15 years, and it has a better discount, and this can't meet a minimum discount, we have more flexibility to say, well, we're gonna flip and try to do a different type of a transaction. Ultimately, the discount that I'm referring to is sort of the net result of what we receive. So there are a number of other fees associated with this transaction. Any bond transaction typically has a lot of other fees related to this, or counsel fees, both the bond underwriting counsel as well as disclosure counsel, underwriters counsel. There's the financial advisor fee, the swap counterparty, the credit rating. So really all the parties I've mentioned, they're all getting paid in this transaction, of course. Fortunately, that is all sort of taken out of the bond financing proceeds. So we are not at risk with those fees if we don't move forward with this transaction, one. And two, the 10% discount that we are forecasting is the sort of the net result after all of these fees are deducted. I think I touched on this last point already, but again, this reprices every 5 to 7 years, which is the optimal sort of timing for repricing the bonds. That's good and bad. If interest rates change, interest rates generally, if they go up, there's generally more spread. And so we could see an increase in the discount in future pricing periods. But of course, conversely, if interest rates go down, that could hurt the transaction. It could reduce the discount. I guess the good news is right now interest rates are generally low from a market perspective. So directionally, it's more likely that interest rates will increase. So there is some opportunity that discount could go up. Next slide, Adrian. So here are some of the key documents. I will note there are 20 documents or so involved with this transaction. So there is quite a bit of some documentation agreements to kind of work through, but this is where we're really highlighting the material agreements. There is the prepaid agreement itself, which details the flow of power and payments between the parties. So the prepay supplier and really the conduit, the conduit issuer. And it lines out all the scenarios in which the deal might terminate early. It has very similar terms to the power supply, the power supply agreement. And I'll just jump to that. The power supply agreement really sets forth the terms for which the CCAs receive energy for 30 years. So this is one of two documents that the CCA actually directly signs. In most cases, it is the bond issuance conduit that is actually signing on behalf of the CCA most of the agreements. The repricing agreement, moving back up one, that is the agreement that sort of specifies the terms of that sort of 5 to 7 year repricing, and make sure to kind of lay out how that happens, what sort of indicative rates Morgan Stanley is providing to us, the load serving entity, to have a sense of what is the achievable discount. It does include some factors that would allow us, if to the extent the deal looks uncompetitive for some reason, that we can actually go and pursue other sources of funding. So things like that really help de-risk the transaction. And some of those elements are in the repricing agreement itself. There's a letter agreement, and this is one of the other documents that the CCA signs directly, but this is between us and the issuing conduit, so the JPA itself. And this kind of lays out the terms for how we work with the JPA. Ultimately, the JPA is issuing the bonds on behalf of the CCA. And so this letter agreement really sort of stipulates that the decision making is really by the CCAs, right? The issuing conduit is just sort of a shell vehicle, but ultimately it is the CCAs that will help sort of drive the decision making around that. And so the letter agreement kind of lays that out. And then lastly here is the commodity swap documents. And basically there is a third party swap counterparty that's also involved with this that would move from a fixed to floating price depending on the time period of the transaction. Next slide, please. I know this material is pretty dense, so to the extent there are questions from board members, feel free to interrupt me, and I'm happy to address them as we go along. There are a handful of additional slides going forward, but maybe I'll just take a really quick pause because I know I've been talking a lot, and just make sure there wasn't anything that I should address before moving on from the board members.
Board members, any questions at this point?
Not at this point, thank you.
Kathy, go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. I think you touched on this briefly, but I guess 2 questions around risk. What happens if the prepaid supplier goes bankrupt, has an earthquake, in essence can't deliver the power? What hedge or how do we guard against that? That would be question 1. And question 2, I think with the bonds resetting every 5 to 7 years, is there any way to hedge that against, I guess it would be rates going down? No, actually rates going up where it would negatively impact the pricing on this?
Yeah, let me address both of those questions. So the first question is what happens if the prepay supplier goes belly up, is not able to perform? And so I'll say the underlying energy itself are existing contracts that we have signed, a solar PPA with a specific developer or counterparty. We are assigning that transaction into this kind of vehicle, and Morgan Stanley becomes the prepay supplier. So if there's an earthquake of some sort, it's not as if Morgan Stanley is actually operating that project. We're really taking our existing transactions and flowing them through this transaction. And so there's no increased risk to the performance of our existing renewable projects. With that said, there's still financial transaction there. So if Morgan Stanley were to fail, if they were to dissolve, which obviously Morgan Stanley is a very credit-worthy entity and has a good credit rating, and quite a large balance sheet, as you would imagine, but there's always that risk. To the extent that were to happen, the transaction would likely collapse. And if that were to happen, the PPA that we've assigned into this transaction would get put right back to us. So again, no disruptions to the energy supply of that contract itself. The downside, of course, is that we would no longer have the discount that we're expecting to get through this transaction. But again, we're losing out on that, but we're not paying more as a result of that otherwise. So that's your first question. The second question you had was, sorry, will you refresh me on that one?
Well, related to the interest rates when you have to reset at 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, so it's difficult to lock that in. The whole point of this transaction is that it reprices every 5 to 7 years. But there are a couple things I'll note. What this looks at is the spread between the taxable rate and the tax exempt rate, which historically is almost always where the taxable rate is higher than the tax exempt rate. And so that creates a spread, and the discount that we're receiving is premised off of that. That is almost always the case, I say, but obviously it's not always the case. There are times when actually the tax exempt rate will invert and be higher than taxable spreads. That is very, very unique. I won't try to explain that because you probably need to spend quite a bit of time, and I'm not even the expert to try to do that, but there are unique market conditions where tax exempt rates can be higher than taxable rates. Very unique. To the extent that happens, there's not a risk that we would take like a negative discount and therefore be paying more money for this, just to be clear. There's a minimum discount here, and it is a positive number. To the extent you had these kind of weird market dynamics where the spreads inverted, we would not be liable for having to pay some, premium for what we're transacted on. So that we can fully step away from the transaction if they get below our minimum discount. And in terms of locking in a discount just to ensure that we have some certainty of that, unfortunately, you can only do that for these sort of 5 to 7 year periods. It is possible you can do that for a longer period of time. That's really where we look for guidance from say the Morgan Stanley counterparty to help determine what is the optimal spread. Their interest and our interest is to actually do a longer transaction and to lock it in as much as possible. But the sort of the modeling determination is doing more of a 5 to 7 year time frame is actually better off to optimize the discount ultimately. But that doesn't mean that markets can't change, and say a 10-year bond may end up being more favorable than a 5-year bond in future time frames. And if that's the case, we would try to lock in sort of a longer duration, all things being equal.
Okay.
Howard, I have a follow-up question to Kathy's question, and I understand Kathy's question clearly, because as you look at PERS, for example, and the discount rate and its impact on local governments in terms of the amount that we will pay every year, how that amount fluctuates depending upon the discount rate. Sometimes there's an uncertainty as to what the savings might or might not be down the road. The 5 to 15% savings that you mentioned, is that something that our customers will see a savings as a result of this transaction? Or are these savings rolled back in to offset fluctuations of the different rates that may or may not occur over the 30-year period of time?
Well, I would say it's not necessarily pegged to anything specifically, right? So this, at the end of the day, reduces our energy costs. So, secures our ability to continue providing energy to our customers cost competitively, and hopefully ensure that we can provide them some form of a discount like we currently are doing. So it doesn't mean if that fluctuates suddenly, rates will go up, and if there's a greater discount, suddenly rates will go down. We have that ability to do that. Of course, that's the board's determination of how we set rates. But at the end of the day, of course, if we have tools that we can utilize to reduce our energy costs, that enables us to either spend more money on local development. It allows us to, increase the discount that we have. So, there's much more of an indirect, kind of index there.
And I think the more that we can actually market those savings as we roll out these different opportunities, so that our customers see that we're being very fiduciary minded, I think will be of benefit to our customers to see that. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Absolutely. And I'll note, obviously this transaction is, only tax exempt entities are eligible for this type of transaction. So, it's worth noting that PG&E specifically, as a privately traded investor-owned IOU, investor-owned utility, they're not eligible to do this. So this is definitely a structural advantage that we have as a municipal utility. So certainly one of the reasons why we've invested so much time and effort in this process, so we can ensure that we can offer a discount through tools like this.
Excellent.
Let me move forward. Oh, sorry. Was there another question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to follow up, you triggered, and I don't mean it to sound the way this is probably going to come off, but if this is really a good deal, why aren't other CCAs doing this? I mean, because it sounds like there's only 4 really interested in it at this point. Maybe I'm not understanding that correctly, but.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me just note. So when I say 4 happens to be the founding members of the JPA, but that's because we are the sort of the larger JPAs that are a little further along in evaluating diligencing this structure, and the conduit that we have approved, the JPA itself, will other CCAs will be eligible to utilize that JPA as associate members. So, but you don't need, the conduit is more of an administrative conduit, so you don't really need too many hands in the kitchen to sort of manage some of the administrative processes. So we found it to be more effective just to have, you know, 3 or 4 parties involved there, and then other CCAs can utilize the conduit itself. There are other CCAs out there evaluating the transaction. I would say, you know, it is probably a half dozen or so. I think many have noted they have interest, and it's really just a matter of bandwidth. And, you know, we have been at this for a year and a half. You know, this is a pretty financially technical, you know, transaction to diligence and negotiate. And so like many other things, you know, we hope that we're paving the way to, you know, to de-risk this type of transaction, and other CCAs will probably utilize it in the future as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And certainly to your point, I think that's one of the key reasons why we wanted to move forward with Silicon Valley, because it is earlier, you know, one of the early transactions. So we just wanted to make sure that there were other parties involved, so that we weren't the sole party to sort of diligence something. We could rely on other smart people to help. Okay, let me move on quickly, because I know we have a budget item as well, which is going to be a fairly meaty one. So here's just a sort of a box and arrows diagram of how this works, of what I previously described verbally. In the middle here, you can see that's the municipal conduit. So that's the JPA that we had approved that we will soon form. To the right, of course, that's what EBCE represents, the load serving entity, the CCA. And then on the left is, in this case, Morgan Stanley serving as the prepay supplier. And then at the bottom, you can see sort of the bottom right corner is what we would sort of identify as the existing long-term PPA. And we would sort of assign that over to, in this case, Morgan Stanley as the prepay supplier, and basically it ends up flowing through back to the CCA via the municipal conduit. And so, whereas we would have otherwise received the energy directly in that arrow to the right from the PPA, it basically assigns into the prepay supplier and flows in through the other direction. But as I've talked about, all of the energy product remains the same. Our payment remains largely the same, but minus a discount, of course, which is why we're doing this. And instead of paying the counterparty directly, it actually flows through the municipal conduit to the PPA, to the prepay supplier, and the prepay supplier into the existing counterparty. Next slide, Adrian. So benefits, obviously, we've talked about this already, but really it's savings over the 30-year term of this transaction in the 5 to 15% range-ish. You know, we talked about the savings from this initial transaction would probably be in that kind of $1.2 to $1.6 million range. But what I would highlight is, you know, that is a fairly small percentage of our energy costs flowing through there. And so we can envision ourselves doing additional transactions identical to this in future years. You know, we could do one every year for the next 5 years and try to just layer on more, and ultimately get, just more and more of our energy costs flowing through this. You know, there is some limitation of that, of course. You don't want, you probably don't want to get to 100% of your energy through this. Then you might just lose a little bit of flexibility with how you structure your transactions. I think in talking to sort of our advisors and counsel, you could easily get to 50%. You do have natural gas prepays where the municipal utilities are doing significant portions of their natural gas flowing through these transactions. And so you can envision, you can get 5 to 10 of these prepays in. And if we were to do the next transaction on our own and not jointly with another CCA, there would be more volumes flowing in. So you can get some pretty meaningful savings, $10 to $20 million sort of order of magnitude level. And certainly if you wanted, you could go above that. There's, obviously it does take some work to do these transactions, but we're actually doing a lot of that work right now. So in future iterations, you could imagine it would be a much lighter process to issue this. And so if market conditions were favorable and you saw a significant spread, you may try to be really quick to try to issue one of these things and, get more discount out of it. It is a favorable risk allocation where EBC only pays for energy that is delivered. So there's no sort of increased risk of that. The debt is non-recourse mentioned. And generally speaking, the rating agencies have been comfortable with these types of comparable deals from large California energy entities like SMUD, SCAPA. They have exercised these things. a mix of natural gas prepayment deals, and they've done some unique transactions where it's sort of a hybrid between natural gas and electricity, actually. Next slide, Adrian. The risks here, if it doesn't materialize and we're not even able to execute on transaction, there are some out-of-pocket expenses that we're on the hook for, 25 to 50K, so pretty small in the grand scheme of things since most of the contracts are contingent. Really the risk is opportunity costs. Is there better mousetrap that happens in 5 years, 10 years? And we've put some of our volumes through this and we could get a better discount elsewhere. Yes, that risk exists, but as we've noted, we have plenty of energy procurement costs to flow through. So if a better mousetrap gets invented, we'll probably have other volumes that we can flow through there. So I don't think that necessarily diminishes what we're able to do and take advantage of. The regulatory risks, we've talked about those, so I won't reiterate those, but there are some, but we feel like we've addressed those. The last one I'll just note is, always worth mentioning is there any political risk, right? This relates to sort of tax issues. And so if a transaction were to collapse due to non-performance or anything, is there some reputational risk or political risk that we should be thinking of? And certainly we should highlight that. I think that, that always exists. This is a fairly tried and true sort of structure. So I think that risk is fairly low. And as I mentioned before in the prior slide, there are some very large reputable municipal entities throughout the country, including in California, that have transacted on similar types of structures. So I think it's a low risk, but obviously our board is very conscious of that type of political and reputational risk. Next slide, Adrian. So timeline, we've been at this for some time already, since November of 2019. We've been in the document negotiation process. I think we're at, getting to the tail end of that process, fortunately. I think we'll be able to, kind of hopefully get there on, execution ready documents in the next 2 months or so. And then we would look to do the bond raise. And as I said, there was a deal that just priced, I think, last week. And so the markets have opened back up. We will see where spreads continue to go. You have to look at, where is their appetite amongst bond investors. But, based off of the timing for getting documents ready to go, and just there's other steps in order to make sure this is all enabled with the JPA and getting in place some policies related to the JPA. We think this will probably be ready to initiate in the next 3 to 6 months. And some of the factors that play into that, part of it is just markets. Markets could close up next week for some reason if those spreads don't continue to persist. We do need to get some assignment rights in our commodities transactions to flow through this. At the outset, I think that's a fairly low risk that we won't be able to get those contracts in. So that's kind of where the timing sits. My expectation is to try to take this to the board as an action item, probably in June, to be approved to be able to move forward. And then, if markets are open, then we're ready to sign when the best spreads are there. That could be July, August, September timeframe. And I think we want to be able to do that without having to take it to the board and miss a window of opportunity. I guess some feedback that I'd like to hear from the board is, if we want an action item in June, how many more touch points do we think we want to have with the board before then? Do we want to do an informational item in May? Do we want to bring this to exec-com? Things like that. That is a question we have. But before we get there, just one last slide. I won't spend much time on this, but just some, Adrian, there we go. Just some market statistics that we've shared before, representing, why this is a pretty tried and true transaction. There have been 90+ transactions done, 50+ billion in notional value. A number of these transactions in California specifically. You can see here sort of a handful of kind of well-known financial institutions that do these types of transactions. And again, resource types, this has generally been done on natural gas, looking to apply that towards energy and electricity with what we're looking at here. Sorry for the density of that information and the quick talking from me. I know there's a lot there. But I wanted to make sure to, just go through all the different details. So I'll stop there and see what comments and questions the board has.
Sure. Let me suggest, if I may, to my colleagues, let's go ahead and see if there are any comments from our anyone that's listening in, and then we'll come back to any board comments and suggestions to staff moving forward. Adrian, are there any members of the public that want to speak specifically to this item?
There is no one signed up for public comment for this item.
Great, thank you. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues to see what comments and suggestions you might have to staff moving forward. My initial comment, Howard, was an excellent presentation. I think it's an excellent opportunity. Anytime we can purchase energy that is at a discount rate that benefits not only our CCA, but our customers in the long term, I think it's a great idea. In terms of where I think you need to move going forward, I think certainly you'd want to brief the executive committee on this before it comes to the full board. But I think an informational item to the full board when it comes forward, I think would be sufficient. But I'll certainly look to my colleagues for their comments. Thank you, Howard.
I could chime in.
Hi, Councilmember Marquez.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard, for your presentation. It was dense, but I have a better understanding now. So thank you for that detailed information. I just want to be clear that this is one mechanism to purchase energy. It's not the only mechanism we're going to be using in East Bay Clean Energy. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. I mean, this doesn't lock us in. I mean, we still have a lot of energy to procure and different types of transactions we could look to do. So it doesn't sort of, as I said, generally, it's actually a fairly small sliver of our overall energy costs. And the other thing I would just sort of, I guess, clarify is it's not necessarily a mechanism to procure energy. I mean, it is because it flows through the transaction and Morgan Stanley serves as our energy supplier. But I want to just highlight that it doesn't change the way we approach procuring renewable energy through our long-term PPAs. We would continue to do that the exact same way that we were otherwise doing it. So it doesn't limit how we do that or change how we do that.
Okay. Morgan Stanley is just in charge of the transaction, and this is creating opportunity for receiving those discounts.
That's right. We are assigning in our energy contracts that we would otherwise sign and execute to them, and then it flows to us. Yeah.
Okay. And then if staff can please just remind me, I know there was comments about soliciting counsel and even choosing Morgan Stanley over a year ago. What is the requirement to receive board approval for contracts? Is it anything over 50, 75? I don't remember what that number is, and I want to make sure I have it in my notes.
You mean the dollar level threshold?
Uh-huh.
Is any annual contract that exceeds $100,000 supersedes sort of NIC's authority, and so we would need to take that to the board.
Okay, and then just to give feedback, I do agree with our chair that this should be shared with the executive committee. I don't know timing wise, informational item. I don't know when the next time the executive committee meets. I believe they might have met this morning or next Friday.
It's usually the last Friday of the month, so it'd be later in May. It would be the next month, basically.
So if you want to get this on June, I think there is that window of opportunity to get an informational item in front of the entire board, which means the third Wednesday. So I don't want to lose out on that opportunity. So that would be my preference. Thank you.
Okay. So just to clarify, the recommendation there is to take this as an informational item to the full board for the May meeting, and then also the exec-com meeting in May. No.
Because the order of sequence, right? The entire board meets first.
Yeah.
And then the executive committee. Ideally, I would love it reversed, but I don't want to, just seeing the response we got in our last meeting, it seems like the entire board wants to be kept apprised of these.
Right. Okay. So take it to the full board in May. No reason to take it to exec-com since they're going to be at the full board, and then we'll take it in June for action. Okay. Great. Thank you for that feedback.
Thank you.
Great. Any more board comments?
So I'll just quickly weigh in. I agree with that I do think that this is complicated enough and important enough that it should go informational to the full board before we're asked to actually vote. I think if I'm understanding all this really correctly, I think that the savings or potential savings from this are going to be really important to the value added proposition of EBCE when you consider the number of power plants that are going to be taken offline in the next couple of years. And I've got to believe there could be some supply issues, which, could drive up energy prices and so forth. So this could be a way to offset that a bit and allow us to continue to maintain that value proposition, which I think is really important.
And I'll just add, but to comment on the chair's comments for future reference, if we're not against the pressure of time, ideally the committee that the item pertains to the most, the executive committee, and then the full board. But right now, I don't think we have the luxury of that. So that's why I agree, right, just for this situation to bypass the executive team. But for future reference, if we could go in that order, I think would make the best sense.
Absolutely. And I will just note, and this may have actually been before some of you members joined, we've actually presented this to the exec comm and the FAT meeting in prior instances. I think there was just feedback of, it's so complicated, let's just make sure to continue to bring it forward. So they have been briefed on this. Obviously, as we move forward, there's always more details to provide, but we have spoken to them about it.
And I appreciate Board Marquez's comments. I think the notion that you mentioned, Howard, that these are contracts that we already have in place. These are energy contracts where we've already purchased or are going to be purchasing the energy. This is simply an opportunity to create a conduit where we might see some additional savings for RCCA and or for this Joint Powers Authority. At the end, and at the end of the day, it might be resulting in a cost savings to our customers, which is certainly what we're all striving for as well. So great. So I think you have direction from the board as to how we'd like to proceed on this. There were no other public comments on this item. Anything last comments on this, Howard, at all before we move on?
No, that was great feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. And before I move on, ladies and gentlemen, to the next item, we neglected, I apologize, there was a member of the public that wanted to speak during public comments on items not on the agenda. So Adrian, if you could recognize Audrey, we'll give her 3 minutes.
Audrey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very educational, even though I signed up, I didn't sign up for it. So I take you to a wider picture, and I wanted to speak about EBC's funding and support for local development, which I'm sure everybody supports. As EBCE gets financially stronger, it can and must do much more, though, for local development. And I allude to the pandemic, of course, as well as the death of George Floyd and so many others. It has taught us a great deal about our communities, how we work, where the stresses mainly fall, who suffers the most, and who is increasingly left behind. And all this happens while so many of us benefit from the hard work and hardship of people in underserved communities. So this is an opportunity to take, and we cannot go back to how things were. In this context, I wanted to call attention to two initiatives that EBCE has launched and needs to expand. One is the Disadvantaged Communities Community Green Solar Tariff program. And secondly, it's planned to do some community banking. Number one, concerning the DAC Community Solar Green Tariff Program, I think it's great that EBCE is going to participate, and it has excited some of us in the equity nonprofits. So you know about this program, which aims to bring the benefits of rooftop solar to disadvantaged communities and renters of all colors. I think many community nonprofit groups could be enlisted in the outreach effort, but EBCE needs to establish a specific budget for this difficult and time-consuming work. Moreover, I think that EBCE can do significantly more here with relatively little cost. The DAC CSGT program is one that the CPUC created. But on its own initiative, I think EBCE can sponsor adding solar to these systems so that these community solar sites can also function as truly accessible community reliance centers for DAC residents in times of emergency. The second thing I wanted to highlight was the EBCE has undertaken to do some community banking. And this is great. It's the item 6 of on today's agenda. this action directly supports local development, but it can do more than just supporting community lending. As an added consideration in selecting the bank, EBCE should consider a commitment to social equity and environmental goals. I would like to suggest a bank to add to the list that is cited in item 6, and that is the Beneficial State Bank. Although it has branches in California, Oregon, and Washington, it is headquartered in Oakland. It is a certified B corporation and is mandated to produce meaningful social justice and environmental benefits, while at the same time being financially sustainable. Beneficial Bank State Bank was founded by Tom Steyer and his wife, and it is a certified CDFI, a community development financial institution. So those are my 2 comments, and I'll close by saying that the pandemic provides us with an opportunity to make fundamental changes. And I hope that we take this chance while we can. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for your comments. They're greatly appreciated. The next item on the agenda is item number 5. I'm sorry.
We have one more raised hand in our from the panel and from the attendees.
So we've already had the public comment section. Is this another public comments item?
I'm not sure if this is.
Let's do this. Let's go ahead and get through the agenda, because I want to make sure that we get through the items. And if there's still public comments after we've gone through the agenda items, I'm happy to entertain them at that time.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So the next item is the draft budget review.
Thank you. Let me unmute. Adrian, can you pull that up, please? Doke. All right. My intention here is to walk through our draft proposed budget for fiscal year 21-22. Adrian, can you actually center this so that the table is fully visible in the window? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's good. Perfect. This will be our 4th budget that we will have brought forward, as part of EBCE. For some of our members here who are new to the board, I'll talk just a little bit about our process, and then I'll jump into the numbers. We typically, so we operate on a July to June fiscal year. And when we have a policy of bringing our budget forward at the same time as we bring forward kind of a consideration of our customer value proposition or our discount, which is it's sort of our annual rate making. And we don't have a sort of a separate rate making because all of our rates are indexed to the PG&E rate. So, we annually, in the context of our budget, evaluate whether or not we need to modify our discount or not. And so, this year, for context, we are not proposing any modification to our customer value proposition. Last year, we did modify it. We reduced it from 1.5% to 1%. And the prior 2 years, it was set at 1.5%. So this year, we're aiming to maintain that 1% savings for customers under the Bright Choice Plan. Brilliant 100, as you recall, will be closing at the end of this year, and we're going to maintain our 1 penny more a kilowatt hour cost for our renewable 100 rate. So I think that's just something I wanted to contextualize here as we're talking about our budget too, because obviously our value proposition and our finances are inextricably linked. So kind of thinking first, maybe starting with a little bit of a background on our prior year's performance. Last year, we set a budget, and you'll see kind of how we kind of laid things out. Last year, we set a budget that we kind of viewed as kind of essentially close to breaking even. And our experience through the year has actually been, stronger than we had expected. Some of that has to do, and I'll walk you through some of the kind of nuances of our accounting. Some of that has to do with the fact that the power charge indifference adjustment, which is the fee that our customers all are required to pay by PG&E to offset their costs of having bought energy on behalf of our customers, was lower for the first half of last fiscal year, and is now going to be higher for the next 3 years because of the fact that it was materially lower in 2020. And you may recall, we've talked about this at some of our board meetings. There was a settlement between the CCAs and the utilities to amortize a very large balance, kind of a one-time very large balance of the PCIA charges over a 3-year period, so 21, 22, and 23. So practically speaking, when in FY 2021, we experienced a $27 million increase in our net position, but which is about $20 million more than we had forecast. So that's great. We are holding back $20 million of that net through a tool that we have called a GASB 62 account, which allows us to take revenue from one year and hold it in account to be recognized as revenue in a future year. And that $20 million of revenue deferral equals the outstanding balance on the PCIA amortization for the year, for the second half of 22 and all of 23. So we're basically putting money aside in this GASB deferral account to ensure that we have the resources necessary, not in this coming fiscal year, but in the following 2 fiscal years, to cover the amortized value of the PCIA. So the effect of that, though, is we're actually ending up very close in this fiscal year to what we had forecast, which is a $7 million net increase in net position relative relative to all of our costs and revenues. I think 7 million seems like a lot, but when you think about $435 million of expenses and almost $400 million in operating. I'm sorry, 435 million in revenue and almost $400 million in expenses. $7 million. This is actually not that much money, right? It's a couple percent. So a couple percent we operated effectively with a couple percent margin when we account for the revenue deferral last year. So we're pleased about that because of the dynamic nature of the energy markets, with prices having risen very significantly, and the continued pressure that we're facing from the PCIA. To be able to operate margin positive is always a good thing. So just kind of using that to kind of contextualize our budget going into the next year. We are bringing forward a budget that we feel kind of fully and to the degree possible accurately reflects our view of both the current year PG&E rates and our forecast for the first half of 2022 for their rates, and our energy expenses. And those energy expenses are both costs we've actually, incurred with contracts that are set, and our forecast for the costs of those energy expenses we have not yet incurred. And we use a number of forecast methodologies, including publicly available price curves, to inform those price forecasts. So at the highest level, we are forecasting a not inconsequential, but relatively small further increase in our net position. So, positive margin of a couple percent, on 482 million expenses, a $13 million profit, if you will, is about 2.5% margin. So that's a thin margin, I would say, but sufficiently high that I think, do we end up, plus or, we'll probably end up plus or minus 10 million or so on that number. So perhaps we end up really truly breaking even. Perhaps we end up, doing a little bit better than 13 million, but I think kind of that range of a couple percent sensitivity on the 13 million is pretty reasonable, we think. So, electricity sales, that the underlying assumptions in our electricity sales. Why don't we go to the next slide, actually? So let's go to our base case revenue assumptions. And we'll go back and kind of, so our base case assumptions are, our current levels of customer participation. So we have roughly a 3.5 to 4% opt-out, current level opt-out of our current communities. We are assuming conservatively a 5% average opt-out from our 3 new communities. So far, that's not been the level of opt-out, but we figured let's be a little conservative there. Because we don't have certainty around exactly where customers are going to transition, as Brilliant 100 closes, we don't assume that they're going to per se be on Renewable 100 or Brilliant 100. So there is that where the cities land in terms of modifying their default could adjust costs and revenues a bit, but for the most part, that should actually offset each other. Renewable 100, yes, higher costs, but higher revenue. Brilliant 100, lower costs, but a little bit lower revenue. So, potentially some adjustment there, but, in the scheme of things, fairly small. We are going through, as you likely have perhaps seen in your home mail, but, very also heard from us, a transition to time of use rates. So we have embedded that time of use transition in our revenue assumptions. We do not apply GASB revenues from basically accruing in this year. Whereas we have GASB revenues that we're deferring to future years. We're not actually bringing previous deferrals into our revenue assumptions for this year. So this is truly a sort of this year revenue, this year expense. Whereas in the future, we may decide to recognize GASB revenues depending on the circumstances. Fairly modest interest on our cash balances. The current rates are very low. We have some accounts that have the ability to go after slightly higher rates, but many of our accounts need to remain very liquid. And so you're getting, a low rate of return there. There was actually a comment in the public comment about the green tariff, the disadvantaged community green tariff program. So we are actually realizing revenue from the state of California for our administration of that program. So that's about $550,000. And I think one of the other operative things here is last year we assumed a very significant increase in uncollectibles. So, historically we've assumed about 0.5%. We increased that from 0.5% to 2.5%, which is more or less in line with what we actually experienced. We experienced just a titch above 2.5% on collectibles. For this next fiscal year, we are dropping that down a bit from 2.5 to 2. Some of that is based on what we're kind of a slowdown in non-payment that we are actually observing, and some of that is just based on some assumptions around continued economic recovery that is happening as the economy continues to open up. So we're not back to normal. We're at 2%, and then we notch down again to 1.5% for the first half of 2022, with our hope being that not this coming fiscal year, but the year after that, we'll be back to sort of our baseline of around 0.5%. For energy costs, there's not a heck of a lot to say here, other than we have seen quite significant increases in energy costs over the last number of months. Largely, we think due to kind of we're facing a very severe drought here in California and across the West, and hydropower tends to be an important part of both the California but also the Northwest's energy mix, and tends to have a significant dampening effect, particularly in summer, because your snowpack runoff can be robust and it can dampen power prices during drought conditions. The lack of summer runoff causes a greater reliance on natural gas or solar, and so that can have increased prices, a negative effect on us because our energy prices increase. Another effect is just an assumption that we're going to have another very hot year. Last summer was marked by kind of record heat, and the forecast is that could very well happen again this summer. So those two factors are really driving up energy market prices, and that's something that we've internalized in our revenue in our expense forecast. In terms of our overhead forecast, our overhead costs, no really significant material changes to our budgets from year to year for things like marketing and outreach, our legal budget, our public policy budget, our regulatory affairs budget. We do propose increasing headcount by adding 6 additional positions in local programs, marketing, and technology. Some of these increases, reflect the fact that we've now added 3 new communities, and so there's the need to be able to, cover those new communities. There's more work that needs to be done, so we need to add headcount for that. Some of this reflects the fact that we are going through the process of evaluating a new or potentially maintaining our current data management and customer service provider. And in that, the mandate we've been given by the board is to bring our call center into our service territory. So we have a position explicitly focused on supporting any sort of a call center transition and kind of ongoing operations of that call center. And then we have, I believe, 2 local programs positions, one focused on, I think kind of program management of projects that we're pursuing in local programs, specifically as we think about, say, working with cities to deploy electric vehicle charging stations, or working with cities to electrify your municipal fleets. We're going to hire somebody who's going to be focused on the actual kind of execution of those initiatives, actually making sure that things get built, project managing the construction, project managing vehicle acquisition, and working through kind of all the execution side of the details. We also have a position focused on community outreach and engagement around our debt relief and our arrearage management program. So one of the lessons that we've taken from focus group work we've done around our debt relief is really the importance of partnering with community-based organizations to reach people. and help ensure they, get signed up for these programs and they persist in the programs. And so we feel like it makes a lot of sense to have somebody on our team who can be really dedicated to going and acquiring community-based organizations to participate in the program, and then project managing our engagement with them. We do have a cost of living adjustment built in, which is set at 2.5%, which reflects an average, a 3-year rolling average for Alameda County. And we do have a merit and promotion pool that is equal to 5% of our personnel costs. We do have some decrease in other professional services. So, which really reflects a move away from hiring consultants and a move towards insourcing. That has somewhat offset by higher software licensing costs. So really what we're seeing is we're hiring fewer consultants and we're licensing more software to be able to do the work ourselves. And sort of the net effect is more or less, kind of the same cost as the previous year. Okay. In terms of our borrowing costs, we have been leveraging our ability to issue letters of credit. So, in the past, we may have had to actually deploy our cash as collateral. It's more, we find it to be more efficient to keep our cash in control of it and be able to use it as we see best, and replace those cash deposits with letters of credit. There is some interest costs associated with that. We do also have set aside up to $2.5 million to support our potential acquisition of an office building. That's something that we'll go through multiple rounds of board discussion, but we felt that given the current market and interest rates, we would put it in the budget to allow ourselves the ability to, if the opportunity is right, go and buy an office building for our use. And then on the local development side, let's go to page 4. Okay, so for local development, it's a bit of an eye chart here, so pardon me. This year we are proposing a local development budget of $8.5 million, which is an increase from last fiscal year of $6.34 million. That increase, partially reflects growth in our programs. We're now serving 3 new communities. And so we have increased sort of across the board our program budget to reflect, those new communities, and making sure that, these programs are funded sufficiently to be able to support, participation from customers in these 3 new communities. And then we also added around $750,000, and it's marked in our for kind of our debt relief, outreach, and community investment program. So when we say community investment, this line item right here, which is $1.5 million, that's really the catch-all for outreach and for the AMP program, outreach for the DAC GT program. Now, some of that money is being offset by revenue that we're bringing in from the CPUC to defray some of our costs there. But it's a pretty considerable expenditure focused on debt relief and kind of the community support work that we intend to do there. So, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm not controlling it. Let's go to the last slide. in terms of our risks. So, energy market risk, which I spoke to a bit, that continues to be our single largest sort of risk and exposure. You can see considerable volatility in the short run, 10, 15, 20%. And for short periods of time, that volatility can be considerably higher. I think we think a kind of a volatility in the kind of $14 to $28 million is not impossible. So, that could mean all things equal, we go from a positive position of 13 million to a negative of 14, kind of in that all things equal worst case scenario. Now, and there's some complexity here, but in some ways the PCIA serves as a hedge against some of those risks, because when energy market prices are very high, that actually depresses the PCIA. Because the PCIA is calculated as the difference between all these contracts PG&E, all these fixed price contracts PG&E has, and market prices. So let's say PG&E has a fixed price contract for $100 a megawatt hour, and market prices are only $30, then the PCIA is $70. But if market prices are $50, the PCIA drops to $50. So high energy market prices, all things equal, lower PCIA. So there's potentially some uplift that we will experience in the next fiscal year as a result of this year's high energy prices. Uncollectibles and write-offs continue to be a risk. It is challenging to forecast effectively exactly where those values will land. I think the experience of the last year informs us that 2.5% is probably the worst case, given that hopefully we're on the road to some recovery from the COVID pandemic. But if one thing the last year has also taught us is to expect the unexpected. So that is a continued risk. And then there's opt-out risk. We don't expect significant change in our participation from our existing communities. Our experience tells us that, given what we've seen from our 3 new communities, 5% seems like a reasonable benchmark, conservative, if nothing else. But, that is a risk. Customers can opt out, and, that could change our assumptions pretty materially. So why don't we go back to that first page, Adrian? Hey, Adrian, can we get a public comment? My dog is right outside barking, so I just need to let her in for a second. Hold on.
Sure. Adrian, why don't we go to see if there's any public that would like to comment on Nick's presentation before I open it up to board members, okay?
Yes, we have one person signed up for public comment for this particular item, Barbara Stebbins. And we also have Igor Trega with his hand raised. So I will go ahead and recognize Barbara Stebbins now.
Now you can hear me. I am mostly going to comment on the draft LDBP budget, which of course wasn't, the point today wasn't to get a lot of detail on it, but I do have some questions. And I want to remind the board members that we sent a letter, East Bay Clean Power Alliance sent a letter to the board before the last board meeting, really urging the board to prioritize programs that will increase energy equity in EBCE's territory. The compounding problems of COVID and really the economic hardships that it brought make the need to really address equity even more critical than before. And but looking at the budget the way it is right now, we notice that 60% of the budget is allocated for a single program, which is the electric vehicle infrastructure program. And it's not that we don't think, it's important to switch over to electric vehicles, but that program will predominantly benefit middle and high income customers, because lower income customers and customers of color are the percentage of those that own electric vehicles is very low. I realize there may be some jobs created. It'd be very important if we're creating jobs to try and really keep in mind the idea of equity as we do that. So I also have some questions about some of the specific programs. It would be really helpful for staff to clarify which programs are included in collaborative procurement, because there's actually a number of programs there. And then also the community investment, does it also include the community innovation grant? Will there be funding for that this year? I know last year it mostly went to COVID relief. We'd like clarity around what MAS resources are. And we're concerned that many programs are being included in the local development business plan budget that are not really local development of energy resources, such as the sponsorship and events, the COVID-19 relief. And it's not that we don't think those items are really important, particularly COVID-19 relief, but we don't think they really should be funded by the LDBP budget. We'd like to understand about the 3 resources, the legal, and I forget what the other one is, but that have been funded. There are 3 that were added, 2 are funded. We're assuming those are under LDBP because they apply to LDBP programs. So those are kind of the questions we have right now. And then overall, just to hope you will really prioritize, put more of the budget into programs that can really benefit people who don't have disposable income and have huge economic need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Nick, I don't know if you want to comment on any of those questions, or we'll just simply move on to the next.
I'm happy to comment on those if you would like me to.
Sure, briefly.
Okay, sure. So I think maybe I'll start with the comment about kind of the customers that benefit from our various initiatives. I think that's right, that our single largest funding area is transportation, vehicle electrification, transportation electrification. In there, there is a heavy emphasis on investing in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I'll note that in Alameda County, the single largest source of air pollution is from point source transportation. So, trucking, effectively vehicles, particularly medium and heavy duty vehicles, moving along the 80 corridor. So, I think there's a heavy emphasis in our transportation electrification budget on the electrification of medium and heavy duty sources. So, those are delivery trucks, those are semi trucks. There's also a heavy emphasis, in those public fast charging stations that we're looking to invest in. There's a couple things. One, while there's an upfront capital investment, there is reoccurring revenue. So, yes, there's money we're spending today, but our expectation is that, they will generate revenue that we can then recycle back into future local development investment. And, one of the things that we've observed is that much of the public EV charging that is being built today is being built, in places like Whole Foods markets and sort of medium and higher income areas. And one of the challenges that we have, found in extensive research is a barrier for, both low, moderate income drivers and also apartment dwellers is the lack of access to charging. If you don't have a place to charge your vehicle, you will not adopt an electric vehicle. And so we believe that we play an important role in building out the charging infrastructure, that is going to be located in low and moderate income communities and adjacent to multi-unit dwellings. So apartment buildings that wouldn't otherwise have charging. That's going to create an important signal and kind of benefit to the electric vehicle adoption. I think to the point around the cost of electric vehicles today, as more and more electric vehicles are being purchased, there are more and more used electric vehicles. So a Chevy Bolt, a used Chevy Bolt and used Nissan Leaf can be purchased at an equivalent cost of buying a used Toyota Camry or a used Honda Civic. So the affordability of electric vehicles is very quickly increasing, and with more vehicles being available. So we feel that it's really critical for us to close that access to charging gap to be able to support vehicle adoption in our lower income communities. These are also capital projects, and because they're capital projects, yes, they're more capital intensive. So hence the greater budget allocation there. So I think that's my point on transportation to sort of the community investment. That does include some of our community innovation grants. I think we have heard loud and clear from our community, from the board, that this year we really need to focus and spend a lot of time on community and customer engagement to support debt relief. And so our intention is to take community innovation grants and really direct them towards community-based organizations we can partner with to say support higher levels of enrollment in the CARE program or enrolling customers in the arrearage management program. MOS resources, those are marketing resources. Legal resources are supporting contracting for local development projects. And then finally, on the collaborative procurement at this time really sort of encompasses two main programs. One is our Resilient Home initiative, which is the program we're running to deploy solar and storage on residential and multifamily buildings in partnership with Sunrun. And the other is, and we're really getting off the ground this coming year, is our municipal resiliency program. So it's a program where we're working with many of your cities to identify critical facilities where we can install solar and storage to provide both energy savings and resiliency. I think that was more or less everything, I think.
I think so. Thank you, Nick. Adrian, was there any other public that wanted to speak on this item before I turn it over to board members?
Beth Weinberger had her hand raised. If Beth would like to speak to this specific item, if you could please raise your hand again, or if you still want to speak to this item, and we can go ahead and recognize Beth Weinberger.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I am speaking on behalf of my co-congregants in Kahila Community Synagogue, an Alameda County congregation of more than 500 households. And I had raised my hand and put it down again because I don't want to take a whole lot of time. I really wanted to echo the comments, concerns, and questions raised by Barbara Stebbins. I'm in agreement with her, as are the people I represent, about concerns about community involvement and equitable allocation of funds to benefit low-income communities. So I just want to echo her comments. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And I agree with Nick. Let's go back to that first chart and see if there's any board members that have specific questions on the budget, and then certainly open it up to any other questions that board members have. If we could pull up that first sheet, Adrian. Great. Look to my colleagues and see if there's any questions regarding either this sheet or anything else that was presented during the budget discussion.
I just have a quick question. I just want clarity. Nick, you had mentioned, if I'm reading this correctly, we have a surplus of 13,620,000, but you had mentioned that that could come in higher or lower. And what are the indicators of that, and when will we have a better sense of where we're actually going to land?
So the primary, so there's two kind of, the driver for increased revenue is driven most by weather. So basically, if it is hotter this summer than our forecast, we will see higher revenues because people will use more electricity. There's also economic indicators, right? So as the economy, if the economy continues to grow, more businesses are reopening, factories add shifts, that will, those are drivers of increased revenue. So I think that's sort of economic activity and weather on the revenue side. On the expense side, probably weather is the biggest one too, because weather, extreme weather in particular, tends to spike energy prices. So we have embedded our expansion to our new communities here, so that's already kind of accounted for. So yeah, I would say weather is probably the biggest sensitivity, and for energy prices in particular, it's not necessarily weather here in the Bay Area, right? So the extreme weather in February in Texas had huge ripple effects on the cost of electricity in California, because the power grid is interconnected, but probably more importantly, the natural gas grid is interconnected. So if you have extreme weather in Texas and that creates high demand for natural gas in Texas, that can actually increase prices of natural gas in California, which then has the effect of increasing electricity prices as well.
Okay. And then the next time this committee meets is in July, is that correct?
I think so.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's every 2 months.
So will we be given updates in terms of what our expenditures are and the revenue? How are we able to closely track this to make sure?
So we don't tend to do a sort of every 2-month update. We do a mid-year update on the budget to sort of present where things are.
Okay.
Part of that is because some of these costs lag, our ability to report. So in July, say in July or even in September, when we next meet, we don't have a full picture on all of our revenue and all of our costs for September until, October or even November, just because, it takes a while for payments to come. We invoice, the next month, and then payments come in the month after that. So there's a 2-month lag between when people use the power and when they actually tend to pay.
Mhm.
And similarly, there's a lag in terms of when we buy energy from the market, we'll actually buy it, but we might not get the invoice. So we don't know exactly what our expenses are for a month or so. So because of that lagging effect, we tend to feel like it makes the most sense to present, usually in January is when we present for the first 6 months of the year.
Okay. And then are these assumptions based off us getting rid of Brilliant 100 that coming to a close?
Yes.
Are we assuming that communities are going to opt up?
I don't think we actually assumed they were going to opt up. I think we.
No, I think you assumed they were going to opt to Bright Choice for the most
Right. I
part.
think we were going to opt. Yes, we assumed they were going to opt to Bright Choice.
Okay.
And but because really Renewable 100 is priced, it's essentially it's priced to cover the cost. You have higher costs, but also that's offset, should be dollar for dollar with higher revenue.
I'll note the energy cost assumption assumes 90% are migrated to Bright Choice and 10% to Renewable 100. But that admittedly was a little bit of a finger up in the air exercise.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Let me follow up, if I may, before I come back to my other colleague on Board Member Marquez's question regarding budget updates. Now, this is a document that you prepare every month, I would imagine. Would it make sense, and I'll certainly look to my colleagues whether this would be of benefit, would it make sense to have at least this document shared with us via email, maybe on a monthly basis, with just a footnote on any significant trends where we see issues different than we anticipated? Would that be something that would be a benefit to this committee?
Hello, this is Jason Bartlett,
Jason,
finance manager.
Jason,
Okay.
Jason, hold on. Just why don't we let the board see if they would think it's a benefit, and then you absolutely would be good for you to share your perspective.
Sure.
Chair, I if monthly is too much, at least every other month would be very helpful.
Yeah, just with staff giving us an opportunity to see any significant trends, from things that they anticipated when the budget was put together. Just a thought. I'll look to my other colleague to see if there's any further comment on that item.
Yeah, well, so I don't know how both of your cities do it, but we don't really get, a month to month because everything's so fluid with when revenues come in, when revenues go out. Some things are fixed, and but other things you don't. So I would just, I'm a numbers person, period. And I love the numbers. They need to be meaningful. And I wonder if we're trying to drill down a little bit too much. And maybe I would suggest try a quarterly to kind of line things out a bit, or let things line out a bit.
So that's a good suggestion, Kathy. Maybe we look at it on a quarterly basis, see if there's first of all, see if there's any benefit from the board members after we have an opportunity to review maybe 1 or 2 quarters. If we find that it's really of no benefit because the numbers change so significantly, or there's so many unknowns, that maybe then we go back to the traditional method of let's just review it twice per year. Any further comments on that item, Ms. Marquez? Nick?
Chair, if I might, I have a question on the budget.
Sure.
And
Kathy, can I suggest let's figure out this item and then I'll come back to you on your questions, if that's okay? Sure. Nick, your thoughts?
Jason, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, thank you very much. So just to kind of make the panelists aware of the processes that we already have in place, is that we do provide quarterly reports with the financial statements that do provide a budget to actual comparison. And so that is produced, every 3 months. But there is a bit of a lag, as Nick was mentioning earlier, and that we do have to wait about 45 days for transaction settlements to occur after the end of the quarter. So, for example, the first quarter of the fiscal year will end September 30th. We generally have our financial statements and our budget to actuals report available in the first week or 2 of November. And that's to allow for all the transactions to settle. Now, that said, in thinking of the timeline of this committee, there is a meeting scheduled in November. Adrian, do you know the exact date for that?
I'm sorry, for which meeting?
The November 2020.
November.
Board meeting?
No, FAP.
FAP.
That meeting?
That meeting.
I can look it up. One more second.
Okay, well, it's possible that if it is like a week or so before we would normally produce these documents, we can have them ready by then. If we can get it done, we can generally get it done within 30 days. If time, if that is the request, so that wouldn't be a problem to provide a quarterly report.
I certainly don't want to create a lot more work for staff. Nick, I thought you did a great job in your presentation, and Jason, I appreciate your comments. When you say it comes to the board on a quarterly basis currently, Jason, is that what I understand then?
Is that part of the as part of the treasurer's report? We do provide sort of a quarterly.
No, it's separate from the treasurer's report. It is just unaudited financials that we provide
right. Yes,
on a quarterly basis with a 45-day lag that includes a budget to actuals.
Okay, then let's, if I may take back my suggestion and just let's kind of leave it the way it is. And if we want to revisit this issue in the future, because we think it's important that we have that opportunity to do so, then maybe we think about it at that time. So I'm okay with the way that staff's currently handling it. And now I recognize Kathy for any further comments that she had on the budget.
Thank you. So I just had one comment. I don't see a line item for contingency. Or do you look at this as the, in this case, the increase in position of the 13 million? I guess I'm a little surprised. I'm used to seeing contingencies.
We don't have a separate line item specifically called contingency, but depending on the area, we have some, sort of contingency within specific line items. So energy costs, as an example, where we use certain assumptions for pricing out, energy hedges and RA. We assume pricing assumptions that provide a little bit of buffer for us to be able to execute.
I think one of the challenges for us with contingency is sort of there's definitely analogies here with, a city budget, but so much of our, especially our expenses are based on forecasts that are kind of commodity prices, right? It's not, we're not forecasting, property tax revenue and, there are good comps of that. And yeah, there are factors that affect that. But, we're a huge driver of our expenses. What is the cost of natural gas at the Henry Hub, which is, in Texas? So, because that then flows through as that's the benchmark for natural gas nationally. And then, the California prices index off that. And then electricity prices tends to, at least pretty significantly, index off of natural gas. We tend to say, here's our best view. We have hedged ourselves, fairly significantly. So there's a fixed component of that, but there's a lot of variability. And, it's one of the reasons why in this business having significant financial reserves is important, so that that cash, it's that working capital is effectively a contingency against unexpected price spikes.
Okay. Well, I do see some differences between the city budget or our city budget and this, and that we're driven very much off of property tax and sales tax, whereas you're going to be driven, I think, on the energy costs and weather and, a spike in either opt out or opt in, et cetera. So, as long as we're comfortable that there's contingency money in there, I can accept that. It's almost like a slush fund, I think, in the city, if we come up with a program or something that hadn't been anticipated, that we want to implement, there's a place to go, find some money.
I would just add that in addition to the financial reserve sort of serving as that contingency, this maybe the model of an energy provider is a little different in the city in the sense that we rate make. So if there was significant increase in energy costs in particular due to extreme weather and demand, the following year there would be a rate change that would likely reflect that. So it's a lot of it is cash flow, working capital management, as opposed to can you sort of fundamentally cover it or not. Whereas the city's probably they're not going to change the property tax rates obviously year after year, just sort of account for some of that ability.
Okay.
Well, again, thank you for that report. I just want to give real kudos to staff for the deferral of the $20 million for this remaining of this fiscal year and next fiscal year. I always appreciate when staff do a kind of a forecast of where we're going to be in a year or 2 years and take these things into consideration so they're less of a financial impact on the organization. So congratulations on that deferral. Well done. If there's no other questions from my colleagues, we'll go ahead and move on to the last item. And I also want to be sensitive to my colleagues' time since it's 3 minutes to 2. Staff, how long do you think this last item will take on your presentation?
I think it can be very, very brief. We've already deferred this one, so I would suggest trying to squeeze it in. I think there's more information to follow on this. Quite frankly, we actually received some timely information just in the last couple of days that was not included in this presentation. So we'll probably follow up on this topic. It's not going to close it out, but at least presenting what is here, quickly as an informational basis, I think would be useful.
Great, thank you. My colleagues, I'll look to you. Are you okay with staying for this last item? I want to be sensitive to your time constraints.
I have a hard stop at about 2:10 for another meeting where I, physically got to go relocate. Can't click on another Zoom button.
Okay, are we good till about 2:10 then?
Yes.
Then good. Go ahead, Howard, get as much as you can.
Jason, I'll turn to you. You may be muted, Jason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Am I? Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So we've been looking at a number of banks that are located specifically within our service territory, and not just located, but headquartered specifically, because EBCE is committed to investing in the economic growth of its service territory. And one of the ways in which that can be done is leveraging the funds that we hold for various lending practices in the local economy. Now we are seeking feedback and additional local institutions and evaluation criteria. So getting that recommendation earlier today I wrote it down. I just don't have it in front of me, but Beneficial State Bank, I believe it is. Thank you. We will add that to the list and look into it. So next slide, please, Adrian. So currently, we keep all of our cash and utilize for cash management services in River City Bank. They are headquartered in Sacramento. They are a bank that is used predominantly by most of the CCAs. So we do get some advantage from a cash management service with their experience. They were chosen by an RFP. And they do actually have lending practices in Alameda and San Joaquin counties. So we did get, as Howard mentioned earlier, we did get some information related to that we received it this morning, so it's not yet integrated into this presentation, but it will be with the next round. And so we're looking at options and how do we earmark certain funds for territory investments and community lending. Now, to be clear, we're not looking to evaluate a change in the provider for cash management services, but where can we put some amount of cash that can be leveraged for the betterment of the local economy. Next slide, please, Adrian. Good. So a couple of definitions. And the real kind of big takeaway is the difference between a community bank and a credit union. A credit union, or I'll start with the community banks, it's up top, is a depository or lending institution that primarily serves businesses and individuals in a small geographical area. They are for-profit and can have shareholders, but they can be nonprofit as well. There are a few, but they do not require membership to join or to borrow. And then they generally, are focused primarily in that small geographical area that they serve. A credit union, by contrast, is always a nonprofit and is specifically member-owned. Membership is required to join or borrow with and use the services. And that membership can be, determined by any number of factors that's allocated in their charter, such as being a public employee or working for a union, or maybe you're children of military veterans or something like that. It can be almost anything. Next slide, please, Adrian. But the key point is that community banks are generally for-profit and credit unions are usually not. So we did a survey. Adrian, if you could go to the next slide, please. We did a survey. The only criteria that we applied for this survey is if the candidate is headquartered in Alameda County or Tracy. And it was an internet search that resulted in 7 candidates. We now have 8, thanks to the speaker earlier. And just to note, this does not exclude the discovery of additional candidates that at least meet the single requirement we have. And then each candidate was classified as either a credit union or a community bank. And then from their annual reports, we did collect some basic financial information. If you could go to the next slide, please, Adrian. Next slide, please, Adrian. I'm not sure if he can hear me.
May have a lag, Jason. He's on slide 6 right now.
Oh, okay. So I have, that makes sense. I have terrible internet. Anyway, so what we see here is, these are the ones that we identified. They're just in alphabetical order. First, Unified Credit Union, Bay Cities Credit Union located in Hayward, Chabot Federal Credit Union in Dublin, Community Bank of the Bay in Oakland, the Cooperative Center Credit Union in Berkeley, Fremont Bank in Fremont, and Patelco in Dublin. And then out there, I kind of listed their service territory. Are they in Alameda County only, or do they operate in other counties as well? Accessibility, which is determined by membership, and as you can see, the credit unions are membership, the community banks are anyone, and then the total assets that they hold, the total loans, and then a kind of loan to asset ratio, right? To give like an idea of how much are they lending, and so we, again, this is not. For the ones that operate in other counties, this is not like the loan to asset ratio does not mean specifically Alameda County. It just means total across the board. Mm-hmm. Now, it should be noted that the credit union's membership criteria covers a range of eligibilities from, semi-limited, as I was mentioning before, they can be very narrow, like Chabot Federal Credit Union is specifically for faculty and staff at, Chabot. Patelco, broader definition of very close to just regional to the Bay Area, or I'm sorry?
You were breaking up, at least on my computer. I don't know about my colleagues, but you were breaking up.
Yeah, you were breaking up for me as well.
Can I ask a quick question on the credit unions in terms of the memberships? Because I know we're spaced for time. Can membership be simply based on the fact that you're a depositor in that credit union?
I did not see that was a criteria. I'm not sure. I mean, ultimately, a credit union can define its membership criteria however it chooses, but I did not see that in any one of these.
I think it's oftentimes common practices, while they're located in a certain region, they tend to have practices that cover this region. There's no explicit restrictions as you have to actually be based in this area to be a member, though you would imagine most of the members are, of course, local.
Yeah, as I said, the narrowest version was Chabot, which requires that you be a faculty or staff member of Chabot Community or Chabot Unified School District. And the broadest was Patelco, which, did just explicitly say you just have to live, work, or attend service in their service area.
Okay, I apologize. I don't want to lose Kathy and I don't want to lose a quorum. Are you looking at this point, Jason, are you moving in the right direction in terms of identifying the banks that you think we ought to be looking at, or are there other banks that you suggest we might want you to consider?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you. We are still taking recommendations if any are to be provided, but I feel, my ability to search, it has, kind of reached its limit.
Perfect.
But we are open to suggestions if there are any to add to this list.
Great. I'm
If
sorry.
I could just add real quick, I think the reason that we want to present this, because we've heard interest obviously from board members and community members to look locally at our various banks. I think as Jason noted, that on the cash management services, I think it's fairly critical that we stay with River City given their capabilities and the unique setup of our lockbox. But I do think we're looking at potentially, putting some funds into some community or local banks, that may do more community lending. And want to get basically the board's feedback on this, on whether there are additional institutions that we should include in our survey. And two, if there are specific goals or interests that our board members have that we should make sure we're evaluating as we look into the specific banks for, we're trying to look at interest rates, what are the lending practices, things, creditworthiness, things like that, of course.
Absolutely. I'm going to look to Kathy. Kathy, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a couple. So I think to Howard's point, if I was going to expect to have banks or credit unions listed on here, it would be First United, Fremont Bank, and Patelco. Experience with the three of those over in the Tri-Valley. A great community partners, supporters. Fremont Bank, for example, has one of their executives on the Education Foundation and very proactive there in the community with education. Patelco, huge supporter of the sports and things. So I guess my point is they're all very community oriented, which is what I think we want. And those would be the ones that certainly in the Tri-Valley we have experience of. And I would say you've covered the ones that are locally based. There are others that are good, but they're not necessarily locally based in Alameda County. So I guess that would be my thought, that I think you're on the right direction here, certainly from the Tri-Valley.
Ms. Marquez, comments?
Thank you.
Sure. I'll go quickly. I appreciate
And I
the
thank you, excuse me, I'm going to have to run to the next meeting now.
Do
Thank
we need to stop the meeting then at this point because we lost our quorum?
I'm not sure as an informational item since we're
Great.
not taking any action.
Yeah,
that might be
we're not
great.
And
Yeah.
we can also present a report of what we covered that can be voted on at the next meeting. So
And there's nothing here to vote on, so I think we can go ahead and continue the informational item. Kathy, have a great weekend.
Thank you, you all too. Thanks for all the good information.
Ms. Marquez.
Thanks, Kathy. We appreciate your input.
Thank you.
So yes, I appreciate this list. I would just to echo Kathy's comments. I think another column I'd like to see is their benefits to the community. So as she mentioned, I'm aware of some of these banks having foundations. So I think that would be important in terms of leveraging more goodwill in the community. And I'm also in support of what the caller called in about. I forgot who it was. I apologize, but I believe she mentioned Beneficial State Bank is the one that she was mentioning. So I'd like to see that added to the list. And then I do feel like we're very rushed today, and I apologize. I thought we were going to still talk about the budget. I do want to address more issues in regard to the development plan, but I will email staff just to be respectful of everyone's time, but just wanted the public to know I do feel like we covered a lot today, and we're not giving it the time that it requires at this moment, but we're doing our best here. Thank you, Chair.
And Ms. Marquez, I'm happy to hang in there for, another 10, 15 minutes if you think.
I have to go. Yeah, I'm pushing it right now. So
Perfect. Well, I'm just going to then close by agreeing with my colleagues' comments regarding the community benefit that these organizations bring. That would be something that we certainly want to highlight. And Adrian, were there any public members that wanted to comment on this item?
There are no speakers signed up for this item.
Great. I thank you everybody for hanging in there. Howard or Nick, I don't know if you have any last comments, but again, thank you. I try to move this meeting along as quickly as we can, and sometimes these are just issues that take time to get into the details.
My only comment, Director Hannon, is if there are any specific items that you or other of the FAP committee would like to see on the July meeting, let us know, obviously, so that we can make sure to cover those adequately. And we'll try to be more conscious of time going forward, so we can try to get
No, you guys all did great. I would ask that maybe that budget item that Nick covered, bring it back in July. That way, Ms. Marquez it'll be maybe fresh in her mind, my mind, and Kathy's mind, as we maybe have additional questions at that time.
So I will just note, we'll bring the budget item forward in the May full board meeting for information, and then in June we will need to get approval on it so that we have it for our operating, timeframe starting July.
No, I understand that.
Okay, all right, got it.
Perfect. Again, thanks, Jason, for your time. Nick, appreciate your efforts as always, and Ms. Marquez, have a great weekend.
thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.